Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, our second annual Reagan Defense Forum, which was dubbed last year the Davos of Defense, and I think it's lived up to that title. It's doubled in size this year, and if it continues to grow at this rate, we think we're going to have to add another wing to the Reagan Library. Normally, at this stage in the program, we would recognize our distinguished guests. However, since today everyone here is a distinguished guest, I hope you'll mind if we dispense with that, but welcome everyone. I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsors who are here today, who've made the Reagan National Defense Forum possible. First, our platinum sponsor, Northrop Grumman. Thank you. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon are our gold sponsors. Thanks to both of you. And I would add our appreciation to our silver and bronze sponsors, which are all indicated on the signs throughout the Air Force One Pavilion. Now, a tradition we have at the Reagan Presidential Library in respect to our country and the men and women around the world who protect our freedom, we begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, and it's my honor to invite Medal of Honor recipient Staff Sergeant Sal Junta to the stage to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please say it with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Sergeant Quinta. And now I would like to invite Chaplain Wayne McCrae, Captain, Chaplain Corps, United States Navy, to lead us in this morning's invocation.
Good morning. Would you please bow your heads with me? Lord God Almighty, as we begin this day and the discussions that will follow, focused on the protection and the direction of this nation, we pause to ask first that you would keep this great nation under your protective care and blessing. We ask that you would stir within its people a deep love for this nation that will cause us all to work for the common good, and that based on solid principles of righteousness, that the citizens of this nation will always demonstrate a deep affection and love for each other. Inspire us to do justice, to love mercy, and to display such acts of charity that will ultimately reflect our character and maintain this nation as a homeland worthy of our full love, devotion, and sacrifice. May your blessing rest upon this fellowship around these tables, as well as on the pursuits of this day, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain McCrae. Well, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the second annual convening of the Ronald Reagan National Defense Forum. Of last year's conference, Mrs. Reagan said, quote, "My husband worked every day of our 8 years in Washington, D.C. to ensure that our country was peacefully protected and that our military was the finest in the world. He would be so pleased to know that his peace through strength policies are being discussed again at the Reagan Library with a focus on today's new technology and tomorrow's needs." The purpose in creating this annual conference was to take President Reagan's enduring principle of peace through strength and ask in a nonpartisan forum what the standard should be for the current age. At 2013's conference, we heard many answers to that question, but in the 12 months since then, those answers have gone into a dizzying flux. For example, last year it was said that Russia, quote, is, if not always friendly, not hostile to the point of arms either. After its seizure of Crimea, after its incursions in the eastern Ukraine, after its threatening moves in the Baltics, after President Vladimir Putin's recent rants challenging the American role in the world, how can we be certain of the nature of our relationship with Russia in the years ahead? Last year, when experts spoke of terrorism at the conference, ISIS had not even broken out of Iraq, marched almost completely to Baghdad, and come close to establishing a more aggressive terrorist state than the world had ever seen. Today, can we be sure that ISIS will not strike within our borders before we convene for next year's conference? And when we met last year, the sequester had begun to bite into the defense budget, and Washington was refusing to acknowledge that these cuts could compromise America's ability to do its part in preventing a general war among nations. Well, at the forefront of resolving this issue is our first speaker this morning, Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Howard P. McKeon, or known to his friends as Buck. It only fits. Buck McKeon has had a wonderful, if far from conventional life. For example, he entered Brigham Young University in 1958 and graduated in 1985. Proof that he's patient and takes the long view of everything. Well, during that time, in addition to earning his degree, he married Patricia. They raised 6 children. He became active in the Boy Scouts, the Little League, and other civic groups, and built the family's successful business. 2 years after he received his degree, he was elected the first mayor of Santa Clarita, and in 1992, he entered the House of Representatives. We are all very familiar with Buck's district, California 25. After all, it includes the Reagan Presidential Library. So for both his role as our congressman and as a congressional leader, it was appropriate that he became our first speaker at last year's inaugural conference and is again our lead speaker today. And his presence here today is very special to us for another reason. Even though Buck will be retiring from Congress in January, he has announced that he plans to continue his involvement with these Reagan National Defense Forums in the years ahead. And since this event was conceived and implemented by Buck McKeon, we could not be more pleased to have such a distinguished person on our team. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a great friend of America's men and women in uniform, a great friend of our national security, and a great friend of the Reagan Presidential Library, Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Buck McKeon.
Thank you, Fred, for that very warm introduction, and also for what you do for the Reagan Foundation and keeping alive the legacy of Reagan, peace through strength. As Fred said, all of you are distinguished visitors. Welcome, all of you here today. I want to especially thank our panel participants, our donors, our guests and attendees. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for supporting this great forum. Last year, I said we were on our way to becoming the most important national security forum in the country. Today, you're attending the most important national security forum in the country. We have a few active duty military people here today. Would you please stand in uniform? Let us recognize your service. Thank you. This is all about you. There's a story from the Second World War about General George Marshall. General Marshall had many gifts, and this story highlights just a couple of them. Back when he was building the U.S. Army, which back then was still smaller than Bulgaria's, Marshall was approached by one of his subordinates. With him was the head of the Bantam Car Company. The staffer told Marshall about a small utility vehicle that was needed for the war. Several department heads scattered about the Army bureaucracy had rejected this design, but the staffer liked it. Marshall asked, "What do you think?" The staffer replied, "I think it's good." That was all Marshall needed. "Well," he said, "do it." That car became the Army's general purpose vehicle, GP for short. We know it as Jeep, and we built over 600,000 of them during the war. There are some really important lessons there. First, General Marshall chose good subordinates. The staffer was General Walter Bedell Smith, who started the war as a colonel, but ended it signing the German instrument of surrender as a general. He was one of the many young officers selected by Marshall. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, George Patton were also on that list. Second, he trusted his troops to make the right decisions. He didn't interfere. He didn't make comments about, well, maybe it should be this color, maybe the steering wheel should be a different size. He did not micromanage. He didn't offer little inputs where none were necessary. Third, he was decisive. I think anyone who has dealt with Pentagon acquisitions is a little jealous of this story. Marshall made the right choice with the Jeep, and he did so quickly and confidently. But he also had the freedom to make that choice. Today, our military commanders don't have that freedom. And that's one of the big challenges of this forum, and the thing that we should seek to resolve. How do we, as civilian and military leaders, get the right people in the right job? How do we break the bureaucratic chains that are drowning the military? President Reagan said that our military isn't to promote war, but to prepare for peace. This is my last Reagan forum as chairman of the Armed Services Committee. We have the next chairman in the audience here, Mac Thornberry. So I'll leave you with this. Our purpose here today, and for many years to come, is simple. We must have a national security that's prepared, that is proud, and that produces, above all else, peace. Thank you. Now, I'm happy to introduce our first panel, Defense After the Election. Now that the 2014 campaign is over, the 114th Congress must deal with a host of new security challenges. So I'd like to welcome our first panel, the Honorable Ken Calvert, Congressman from California. Mr. Mike Petters, CEO of Huntington Ingalls Industries. The Honorable Eric Cantor, former House Majority Leader. And Senator Jim Talent, former Senator from Missouri. With us today to moderate is Tom Bevan, founder of Real Clear Politics. Welcome to the second annual Reagan National Defense Forum. Over to you, Tom.
Okay. Imagine the moderator. That's all right. Huh? We have another star with us.
This is me.
Okay. From Texas. You just won your second term.
That's right.
Second term veteran. Tell the committee. Sorry.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel. I want to thank the chairman for the introduction. I want to thank Fred and, of course, all the sponsors for putting on this wonderful event. I think I speak on behalf of all the panelists when I say it's a real honor and privilege to be here. We're going to be discussing defense after the election. How will the midterm elections and the start of the presidential primaries impact national defense? And just briefly, we're going to have a discussion for about, I think, 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll be able to take about 10 minutes of questions at the very end. So if you have any questions, please hold them to the end. I think we'll have a mic that will get passed around, and you'll be able to quiz our panelists. So everyone's been introduced. We're all here, so let's get started. There's a sin in journalism called burying the lead, which is when you take the most newsy piece of your story and you don't lead with it. So I thought we'd just jump right into it and ask the question that I think is on the minds of everyone in this room, which is we are going to have a Republican-led Senate now, expanded majorities in the House. And so the question is, what's going to happen with sequestration? Congressman Cantor, I want to start with you. You were part of the group that negotiated the Budget Control Act. And this question is open to all the panelists. But let's start with you, Congressman Cantor. What do you think is going to happen with sequestration?
Obviously, I can now, as a bystander in the private sector, opine as to perhaps what may become of the pressures on the defense budget. And I think all of us are here, and I want to thank the Reagan Library for hosting and also Buck's Vision for putting this together, a phenomenal event. And I wish that the spirit of this event could be parlayed into some relief on the sequester. My sense is the same forces that were in effect over the last several years regarding the defense budget and sequester are probably not going to change unless there is some extraordinary national security event that causes our government, both executive and legislative branches, to respond. And the reason really is this. First of all, sequester, as you know, arose because of the real differences between the two parties in Congress and the White House. And those differences have to do with revenues, how you fund the government, taxes, and they have to do with really entitlements, the disproportionate cause of the deficit, and how you distribute those benefits. And that gap without a bridge is what caused the sequester to come about with the failure of the super committee back in 2011. So I don't see a path where you're going to get a bipartisan relief on the BCA caps or the sequester. And the reason being, that is, there needs to be bipartisan agreement. Even though there's a Republican unified House and Senate now, remember the sequester and the caps themselves, for those of us who know the parlance in Washington, is not a reconcilable item. In other words, there needs to be 60 votes in the Senate in order to take that out. And that goes back to then the priorities of the party. So unfortunately, I would say if that is going to be where we are, that perhaps the Congress can look to try and respond to those pressures and maybe say we've got to really do more with less. And that's obviously what goes on in the private sector in my new life and clients at Moelis & Company. I see that every day, especially in this space. We've got to learn, just as the private sector is doing, to do more with less. Congress can help work with the Pentagon in trying to facilitate acquisition reform that I know Buck and others have been very much about.
Anybody else have thoughts on this question? Senator Talent.
I guess what I would say. Is it on? Right. No, okay. Well, I guess the way I would put it, I'll try and project.
Speak loudly.
Whereas the forces that Eric mentioned, whereas in the past, really did box the leadership and the parties in. I think changes both in the foreign policy situation or the threat climate around the world and the American people's concern about it have now opened up areas of discretion that didn't exist before. So I think absent decision and leadership, it probably will go inertially the way it has in the past. But we have a situation where we saw this in the last election. The American people now rate national security and foreign policy as one of their major concerns. In addition, it is evident the reality around the world tells us that the threat climate is growing.
In addition, the threats really are growing. We are accumulating more risk around the world. And so the real situation and the politics are aligning. I would also say that the case is very clear for a substantial increase in the top line. It's the reason the National Defense Panel came out unanimously, and that both documents and supports those who want to change, and also provides some security to those who are concerned about the risks of voting to change it, because we have this report that suggests we have to go back, not only doing away with the sequester, but going back to the Gates baseline. So I think the overall climate has changed to the point where there is now some discretion to move. And I would add that we have a new leadership in the Senate. I think Senator McCain's already said that one of his goals is going to be to get rid of the sequester. So I think there's an opportunity for leaders to do something here, and I hope they do. We're going to have to do something. I think you're going to see the next presidential candidate. You'll probably get into this in the question.
Indeed.
So I'll save it then for when you talk about
Okay.
the presidential elections.
All right. Congressman Calvert and then Congressman Kessler.
Well, I'll be an optimist for a moment, Eric, but I understand your frustrations, and we've been there. I also serve on the Budget Committee, and there may be an opportunity here if the Senate and the House budget process can get together with the White House and come up with some meaningful tax reform and entitlement reform. That's what has to happen, as Eric mentioned. I mean, that's where let's all face it, the entitlements continue to go the way they're going. There's not going to be any money left for anything. And so that's where we're at. We can have, do more for less, but you can only do so much. And so we're going to have entitlement reform in order for us to ultimately resolve this issue. There are issues in the Department of Defense that we can save a significant amount of money, and certainly procurement is one of them. One point I would like to make is right now we have more civilian employees in the United States Department of Defense in postmodern history. The ratio today of civilians relative to the military personnel is at its highest level since World War II. And that has to change. I can save, just bringing it back to historic ratios, for instance, can save $85 billion in 5 years, and even in Washington, D.C., that's real money.
Congressman Castro.
Sure. Well, first I want to say thank you to the Reagan Library for hosting this wonderful event at this beautiful library here in California, honoring our former president. And I speak, I guess, as probably the only Democrat on this panel. I'm still getting over the depression from the elections a few weeks ago. But I think that the former majority leader is right. It's going to be very difficult in Congress. Obviously we've got a presidential race coming up in the next 2 years, but there is an opportunity. And the reason I say that is because I think what you could have essentially now is a situation that is akin to the 1990s, where you had a Democratic president with President Clinton and a Republican Congress. And so when you talk about sequestration, I think the big hang-up has been most people in Congress, I think, on both sides, on the Republican side and most Democrats, support lifting sequestration for the military. The part of the challenge is Democrats also support lifting sequestration in other areas, healthcare, education, and other things. So the question is, can we have an agreement where we lift it for the military and also lift it for other parts of the budget? I think that's where, if there's a chance for an agreement, that's what the agreement's going to look like. You lift it for the military and you lift it in other areas also.
Are you speaking about a grand bargain?
I am.
Okay. Just wanted to be clear about that. Mike, let me go to you as sort of the industry representative on this panel. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. How is a Republican-controlled Senate going to affect the defense industry?
Well, again, thanks to the library for hosting this event, and I'm certainly not in the inside baseball that my colleagues are here in. I'm sort of in the bleachers watching this game play out, but have to live with the result. And my sense of this is, I think I agree with the last comment there. The congressman points out that you get to a place where the legislative branch can actually put forward a plan for growth and job creation, and the executive branch gets to decide how to deal with that. I think that actually is something that has not been going on for a couple of years. This is an interesting time, because I think that for all of the things that we hear, we actually have a process that is better than anybody else's when it comes to establishing our priorities and applying resources to those priorities. We just haven't been using it for the last 3 years, right? So sequester is a way not to use our process. The Budget Control Act is combining the caps with sequester is sort of a double whammy, if you will. My view is you have to get rid of the mechanism. You can argue about the caps, but you have to get rid of the mechanism because there's no household in America that would say, I've got 10 things to do, I've only got money for 8, so I'm going to do 80% of all of them. Nobody would do that, but that's what our Congress is, that's what our country is doing. And so if we don't get rid of that, it's going to be a long couple of years. And I think it would be a mistake to think that this last election was the country saying, we agree with the Republican ideals. I think it's better to say the country wants economic growth, the country wants job creation. We haven't been getting it over here, so we're going to try it over here. You've got a couple of years. You're on the clock. If we don't get it over here, we'll go back and keep trying until we find a path. And I think that's my read of what's going on. I think the alignment of the Congress has a chance to put that forward in a way that can be very positive. But I think we'll have to watch and see.
Congressman Cantor, back to you and this idea. Democrats hate the sequester for the reasons that Congressman Castor said. Republicans, I mean, everybody seems to hate it. Nobody seems to know what to do about it. So why couldn't there be some bipartisan consensus that's reached in the Senate with Democrats and also in the House with the expanded majority?
So there's two parts, I think, to that question. And one is, where has the divide been? And how do you overcome that disagreement that has been attempted and failed at before? How is this Congress any different? And then really the broader question is about defense itself and whether we all on both sides can agree that since World War II, it's been the military capability of our country that has been directly related to our global leadership. And it's been directly related, as Mike was indicating, with job creation, with the standard of living here. Our military capability is that important. And the question is then, are we going to agree that that is a priority? It's not been a super priority since this agreement has been put in place under the super committee, the sequestration. So why won't it? Why hasn't it worked in the past? And again, I go back to those two issues. And Ken talked about maybe we can get some progress now. Well, the issues themselves, it is those entitlement programs that keep gnawing at the budget, that keep us compressing the defense budget. And there's just not agreement yet on how to address Medicare. That's the entitlement program that's the threat from a fiscal standpoint. How do we address it? And the private sector has gone about trying to essentially transition from a defined benefit to a defined contribution outlook. That is what is inherent in our Ryan budget that has been pushed for years, that has been rejected by the president and his party. So if that isn't accepted, where can we find a middle? Also, we've got to get over this issue of taxes. I can tell you the Republican side hasn't changed its position on that. Unless you fix the problem, I don't foresee the Republican Party, my former colleagues, saying, sure, let's go and tax people more and just keep digging that hole. So you can see sort of the underpinning of that disagreement. And that's what's got to be resolved, those two issues. How do you resolve the problem on the Medicare side? And then what do you do about the other side, the Democratic plea for more taxes? And as far as can't we come to some agreement and just lift the sequester on both? Like forget about the problem. Let's just spend more on both. I don't know if that's really possible because in the past it's not been. It's not been that we want to lift the sequester. Remember why the sequester went in to begin with. It was a result of the debt ceiling discussions in 2011. Back then, the Speaker, John Boehner, had said we're going to cut as much as we're going to raise the ceiling. And we were unable to come up with more cuts, so the sequester came in. So again, I want to be an optimist too, and I know that folks in the private sector and all of us now want to see some resolution to this. It's very difficult. I do think that Jim Talent said something, though, that could very well change the scenario. We, God forbid, could have some national security event that will shake our government and Congress out of this funk, and we'll begin to reassert the priority of defense. Again, I for one, have always said it's existential for us, and we ought not let the defense budget drive our security needs. We ought to let our security needs drive our defense budget.
Congressman Castro, did you have a quick point?
Sure. No, and to that I would point out that over the next 2 years, I hope that each party brings its best ideas forward, whether it's reforming entitlements or how we're going to deal with the sequester. I would point out this, that the conditions for an agreement are better than existed in 2011. The economy is doing better now. We've bounced back further than we did back then. Unemployment is down. So I think we're in a better, the deficit is down. We're in a better spot than we were back then.
Senator Talent, to the point that you were making and that Congressman Cantor made, national security actually did play a fairly substantial role in this election, surprisingly, with ISIS, with Ebola, with what was happening in the Ukraine. Exit poll question. 71% of voters said they were more worried about a major terror attack than they were after September 11th. And so we do have a situation, it seems, where the public is concerned about national security. And also, to the point that Mike made earlier, it also does seem that this election was a get stuff done election, if you will. That was at least part of the message that was being sent. So between the combination of those two things, why won't things get done?
Yeah, I agree. Eric said a major national security event, some disaster, God forbid, could change the climate. And I think a number of major, but fortunately not disastrous events are changing the climate. And as the politics change within Washington, I think the reactions are going to change. And it isn't just ISIS, although right now that's on the headlines. Remember what we've seen the last year and a half. The North Korean adventurism based on their nuclear program, the danger of Iran, getting closer, whether the deal is cut or not, they're very close, given breakout capacity, to a nuclear weapon. Terrorism spreading apart from the Levant to country after country. Russia going, as was mentioned before, clearly from at least a neutral power to an unfriendly one. And then you're seeing that confirmed with things like the National Defense Panel report, and at the same time, what's happening to the military. I mean, we're already smaller than we were in terms of force structure 20 years ago when times were much more peaceful. I mean, none of these threats really existed 20 years ago. And all of this is burying itself into the consciousness of the American people, and they're scared. Now, one of the points I am making, and I think the leadership in both sides may get around to thinking about, and including the presidential candidates, is if you're trying to show, apart from the necessity of doing this, we're going to have to rebuild the military, and the longer we wait, the more it's going to cost to do it. But if you want to show the American people that you hear their concerns and you're being responsive, building up our defenses is the most consensus thing that you can choose to do. Because you're not arguing there for a particular policy in the Levant or for confronting China particularly. We're just saying, look, we need to be strong. We need to have the tools. And then this president, the next president, and the Congresses will decide how to use it. So I think it can be very popular politically, and the American people will respond to that, and they don't care about caps and sequester and budget rules and the rest of it. They're looking to see who will own up and, who will stand up and own this issue and make the military strong again. And somebody, I believe, is going to go through that political calculus and figure that out. If they don't in the Congress, I think you're going to see presidential candidates doing it, and we've already seen some signs of that.
Mike?
Yeah, I think I agree with exactly that. The challenge that we have today is that a lot of what we need to do on the defense side, in the defense sector and in our industry, is a long game. we build our ships not for this president or even the next president, but the president after next is the one that's going to use it. And I'm really concerned as I watch and participate in this process is that we're institutionalizing the short game. Whether it's the daily news, the weekly reports, the quarterly earnings summaries, the annual budgets that we go through, those are all short game kinds of things that are becoming institutionalized in our society. And it's really hard to be in a leadership position and have a discussion about what's good for the long term when you've got all of these short-term alligators speaking to you. I mean, I know my fellow CEOs in the space here, every day they meet with their investors, they're having a discussion about what are you going to do about the share price today versus how are you investing in your business for the long term. My business goes back 128 years. My job is to make sure that 128 years from now, somebody is still there running that business doing what needs to be done. But there's so much pressure to talk about what we're going to do in the short term. And so I think the challenge of leadership, whether it's legislative or executive or industry, the challenge of leadership is to try to always bring the discussion back up to what's the long game. You know, President Reagan was looking at high unemployment, high interest rates, high inflation, and the Russians were being mischievous. So today we're looking at high unemployment, low interest rates, low inflation, and the Russians are being mischievous. Now his solution to that was to build a 600-ship Navy. I'm just saying.
Congressman Calvert, what about that? You've been in Congress a long time, right? 1992, 12th term, just elected. The dysfunction appears to be, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and feel free to play off of what Mike just said or anything else, is that if the message from voters was get stuff done, and there may be opportunities to get stuff done, we're going to have a lame duck session. We're also going to have a president who appears to be signing executive action on immigration in the near future, which the new leaders of Congress have warned will, quote unquote, poison the well. Would that, in your mind, is that going to make things even more dysfunctional? Will it really have a detrimental effect on being able to do some sort of grand bargain that would solve the problem in the longer term as opposed to some short-term fixes?
Well, I'm going to say that, this election, national security was a big part of it, obviously, but the economy is still number one. I mean, it's people don't feel, there may be a resurgence in the economy, but a lot of people don't feel that. I think that there's a consensus there, and so that's where we really need to focus in the short term. That's in a budget agreement, working with the White House, working with the Senate, both tax reform, entitlement reform, which Eric mentioned. That's game one. If we go on to this immigration issue, is obviously as emotional and as powerful an issue as it is, it has a potential of getting off rail of what the number one issue is, and that's the economy. And if we don't fix the economy, it's difficult to go back and fix the defense industry and what we need to do to make sure we have a strong national security, because you don't get a fix on the sequestration and the rest. So the short answer is yes. I'm hopeful the president doesn't take that path, but it seems that he's going to. So we'll see what happens.
Congressman Castro, what about that? Immigration is an issue that, that the president has struggled with, said it was going to be, done in his first year of his first term. He's made a lot of specific promises to the Hispanic community. I'm from Chicago. I interviewed Luis Gutierrez a couple of weeks ago, and he was has urged the president in very strong language, said there would be a civil war within the Democratic Party if he doesn't do this. It appears that he's going to. Do you think that he's going to, and how big and broad will it be?
I do. Based on news reports and what I've heard in Congress, I think it's going to be about 5 million people. The Congress didn't take action for several years, including these last 2 years where the House Speaker, John Boehner, kept saying that the majority wanted to act on it. There were about 230 votes to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill in the House of Representatives, but that bill was not put on the floor because of the Hastert rule, a rule that thankfully President Reagan didn't have to deal with in the 1980s, which is why he beat Democrats who held a majority in Congress back then, beat them on some key votes because Tip O'Neill put bills on the floor. President Reagan also, besides the 1986 amnesty law, issued an executive order on immigration in 1987 for folks that were not captured in that 1986 law. George H.W. Bush did the same thing, and this president, I think, is going to do it next week or the following week.
How are we doing on time? I'm looking for I want to make sure that we get to, I've got a whole list of questions here. So let's move into a sort of.
Yeah, could I make one more remark with respect to the comment about the strength of the military? You know, one of the fundamental tenets of President Reagan was to grow the military and make sure that it was the strongest in the world. And he succeeded in doing that. But since then, there is a growing diversity in opinion among the Republican Party on the military and engagement in the world. 25 years ago, you had a gentleman like Pat Buchanan, who essentially was a lone voice for what we now call isolationism. That strand of thinking within the Republican Party has grown quite a bit, so that you now have people who are both isolationists, so to speak, and those who are more in the kind of the traditional Reagan mold. And so there is this battle within the Republican Party. And if you listen to the debate on the NDAA, Buck, all of us have sat through it now a few times. Well, y'all many more than I have, but I've sat through it a few times. There is a full range and diversity of opinion within the Republican majority on how much the United States should engage the rest of the world.
I'd say there's a little bit of disagreement within your own caucus, too.
Sure, well, and traditionally...
Well, that's a nice segue, because part of our subject of discussion is the 2016 primary. So, Mike, go ahead.
Well, just to finish that comment, though, wherever you sit, there's probably disagreement about that, about whether we're far enough ahead or too far ahead or not far enough ahead. But as watching this from the bleachers again, when the U.S. military has to stand up and say, we are going to go and put people on the ground to deal with the Ebola crisis, I'll tell you the way that I receive that is we have decided to send the military because we've decided that the rest of the government isn't working well enough to do it, and we can count on the military to do it.
And I do think there's an area that actually the idea of military strength is something that can pull together people in both parties who disagree about how that strength ought to be. And it's very important to make a distinction, which Reagan certainly understood, between having the tools and then how you use the tools. We actually deployed less, I believe, under Reagan than we have before or since. And we were at the apex of our strength, and I think those things are connected. And I have said to people who tend to want less engagement, et cetera, in my party and in the Democratic Party, if you're going to have a fortress America, think about this for a second, better be a pretty damn strong fortress. That's not an argument for a weaker military. It's an argument for differently sized and shaped military, but one that's strong, because eventually the threats are going to get to you, and we've lived that in the 20th century, haven't we? So this is an issue, and somebody is going to pick up and realize this, the candidates, if not the leadership, that this is an issue that you can unite parties, and an issue where you will find a consensus, not with everybody, but among the American people, and really take some action that will help the country and will be popular as well.
Congressman Cantor, about that, take a look at the 2016 field and give me your assessment. Let me phrase it this way. Is the libertarian moment dead? There seemed to be a move in that direction. But as you look at the 2016 field and all of the potential candidates that are out there, is there an emerging consensus within the Republican Party on national security and defense?
I think, again, the comments were made earlier about a growing diversity of opinion are probably apropos. I would also say, while our party had always been the National Defense Party, and still overwhelmingly so, it is the other party, frankly, that we've not necessarily seen a growth in that sentiment. So you've got this dynamic going on where it used to be a bipartisan issue, and that would be enough to carry the day. Again, going back to the makeup of the Congress, that's going to be the difficulty now. The defense spending, the caps, all that need to get through the Senate, regardless of what we do in the House if we want to affect the mission that all of us are sitting here talking about, saying we need to strengthen our military. So how does this play out in 2016? I do think Jim Talent has said appropriately, the American people right now, if you look at the polling, they've said they don't like what's going on. Because what they see is night after night, if they're turning on their TV or they're looking online, reports about countries that perhaps we believe would have been otherwise in a safe spot, all of a sudden have been threatened. Europe. Since when was Europe on our radar screen in need of some strengthening as far as U.S. presence is concerned? You look at what's going on in the East China Sea, the South China Sea. You look at the Middle East and the Trans-Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the list goes on. So the American people say, what's going on? And then what made, I think, national security any bit of an election issue this time, because I agree with Ken Calvert, it's still the economy, is Ebola. Is all of a sudden what should have been the government's job of keeping us safe from a familial level, when Ebola comes in and threatens a mom's kid that, God forbid, could contract some disease and is life-threatening, I believe that's really the type of security that began to be questioned in this election. So what happens in 2016? Well, people think that the government's not doing its job. They're unhappy, but yet they're a little bit wary of engaging again. It is certainly a hangover from Iraq and Afghanistan. So how does a candidate go and recapture this vision that Jim Talent talked about reasserting American leadership? Not always using it, not always using the superior strength that we have, but in order for us to be able to be that leader, we've got to have the strength. And a candidate has to capture that. So whether you call it, isolationism, libertarianism, or whether you go back to peace through strength, the whole concept of Ronald Reagan's philosophy was peace, peace. But in order to have that, we have to have a credible military strength. And what's going on with the Iran talks today, I don't think that one could take away that there is a strength being projected from from the military option, so to speak. So that's just one example of where the dynamic has become very troubling, I think, to many people. And the 2016 candidates are going to be able to debate this.
Congressman Castro, I want to get to you in a second, but Congressman Cantor just mentioned the Iran deal, so Congressman Calvert, I will come to you on that. The deadline the administration has set is 9 days from today to announce a deal. Will they be able to announce a deal, or will it get postponed? If they do announce a deal, if the 114th Congress does not like that deal, what levers can they pull, or what will they might do to try and scuttle it?
Well, first I would say a bad deal is not good for this country, certainly for our allies, and I would hope that they don't enter into an agreement that in fact will not work. And it seems from my perspective looking in, that's exactly where we're going. As this process is being delayed, I think that a lot of people in this room probably believe that the Iranians are moving ahead to develop a nuclear weapon. And that is not the outcome that's good for national security for the whole world. So I can't tell you where this administration is heading on this, but I hope that they would not accept a bad deal.
Let's say they do. Is there anything Congress can do to?
Well, I would hope that whatever lever we can pull to say no, we're not going to accept this type of a transaction. We have to do what we have to do.
Congressman Castro, back to you and back to 2016. Talk about the split within the Democratic Party on national security. Hillary Clinton is, by all accounts, looks like she's going to run as the prohibitive favorite to win the nomination. So let's just play the game. What would defense policy, national security policy, look like under a Hillary Clinton presidency?
I think she would be tough, and she'd be very engaged in the world. If Hillary Clinton runs, perhaps with the exception of the vice president ran, you would have somebody who has the most foreign policy experience of any person running in the field, Republican or Democrat. Somebody who knows the actors across the world, the leaders across the world intimately. And she is perceived, at least, I can't speak for her, but of course I think we know that she's perceived as least as more aggressive than the president on military action.
And yet, within the party, I mean, the reason she didn't win the 2008 nomination, arguably, is that she voted in favor of Iraq. Right?
And you bring up an interesting point, because the dynamic of 2008 was that, quite frankly, people felt duped about going into Iraq. And as Eric mentioned, a lot of that still affects the American public's perception of American engagement in war. And in 2008, the candidate that was going to win was the candidate that said, get us out of war as soon as you can. And somebody at that time that voted for authorization, was going to have a very tough time in the Democratic primary. You'd have a very tough time in the general election too, as John McCain did. So we're in a different situation now, right? It's years later. Part of the answer to your question on what's going to happen with the presidential primary on the Democratic side, quite frankly, depends on what happens between now and then in the world with respect to ISIS and these other bad actors. God forbid, if something does happen to our country, if you did have another 9/11, I think that you would see public support increase quite a bit for engagement. But we're still dealing with a nation that is very skeptical about going into to foreign places, about the cost, about the length of stay, about the safety of our service members, and so it's tough.
Mike, jump in here, give us your thoughts on the 2016 field, both sides, and also what role you think national security is going to play in that election.
Well, I think it's going to come back to what I said before, that this election was about economic growth and job creation. I think the next election is going to be about that too, and I think that there's certainly a concern, an underlying current of security that will be debated and discussed, and there will be a lot of those aspects of it. But as an amateur historian, I would say that no country can be strong from a security standpoint unless they are strong economically. And so I really believe that I believe that this is going to be, you got a 2-year time to figure this out. 2 years later, if we're not better off then than we are now, I think it'll still be front and center. And I think that how the game is being played between now and then is going to impact it. And I hate to say it, but this could actually be, the candidates may be kind of victims of whatever happens in the legislative and the executive branch between now and then.
Senator
Jones? Look at what they're actually going to have, and I've been through this on the Romney campaign. Okay, so they're all organizing now. Some of them are more familiar with this going in than others, but they all got to figure out what their policy is going to be in national security. They can read the polls. They also actually do think about what happens if I become president. Okay, so they get the first briefing, those who need it, on what's happening with the military, that the Army's going down to 450 and probably 420, the Navy's headed down to, we can guess 240, 250 at these levels, training is suffering, et cetera, and they're getting about the risks, and they're saying to themselves, wait a minute, okay, I'm going to be president of the United States, I'd really like to have some tools, right? So number one, substantively, they know they're going to have to do something if they become president. Number two, they're in a position where they're going to have to propose things that show they're actually dealing with the concern of the American people, which is there now and is going to grow. It may not dominate economics, but it's going to be an undercurrent. Right. And the people are smart enough to figure out that the presidency matters when you feel unsafe, okay? It could go back to Cold War years where their domestic policies might have a priority in a given presidential elections, but national security was always in the background, right? So you're a presidential candidate, you got to propose something that shows you're going to make America strong and keep people safe. So what are you going to do? You're going to go a detailed policy about how you're going to defeat ISIS in the Levant? Yeah, you might do that. But the first place you're going to go is to show we're going to be strong, we're going to rebuild your military. And look, we've had speeches in the last couple of months, Senator Rubio, right? Governor Jindal, Secretary Clinton understands this. We'll see what she does, and there are dynamics you got to deal with. And one thing I can tell you, I don't think they're going to care about the internal dynamics of the budget process in the Congress in terms of what they propose and what they say to the American people. They're going to try and stay above that and say where we need to go. And if Congress doesn't get there, they'll say, great, what a chance to show the American people I'm bipartisan on their behalf, and they'll attack both sides. That's what I think is going to happen.
One point here. In 2008, the #1 issue in the United States was the economy. Instead, we went off on health care. In 2010, people reacted to that, and we got the majority back in the United States House of Representatives. The biggest issue in 2014 was the economy. And people want us to focus on the economy. As was mentioned, if we don't fix the economy, we can't fix anything else. And quite to my friend, if we go down this path on immigration before we tackle the problems with this economy, we're going to divert ourselves from what is the #1 issue to the American people. I think that's a mistake. I think we need to fix this economy, and fixing the economy and building a strong national security is mutually exclusive. I think we can work together to do that. And so, but the economy is, quite frankly, the #1 thing on the minds of voters. I just came out of an election. Trust me, everywhere I went, that's the first issue they talked about. Certainly they talked about national security, they talked about immigration, they talked about a number of issues, but #1 is the economy. And we ought to focus on that and get it fixed.
Yeah, sure.
If I could just jump in here a little bit. Just over the last several months, I've been traveling quite a bit abroad. And it's interesting to hear really what the countries that are our traditional allies are viewing about America, what their private sector citizens are saying, as well as their governments. And Ken's right, I mean, and Mike, about the economy. You can't have a strong military unless you have a strong economy. But frankly, our strength militarily has a lot to do with our economy as well. They're inextricably tied. For the dollar to be the reserve currency, for America to always be there, to keep shipping lanes open, to ensure the rule of law and free commerce. This is directly related to our economy and our military strength. And when we see our allies abroad questioning what it is America will do, I mean, you can start in Asia. The question is this pivot for real? Well, when they hear talk of sequestration, when they hear talk of defense cuts, what are our allies supposed to think? When we look at the Middle East, and we have some of our European allies questioning, why isn't it that America hasn't been there first? Why isn't it that we aren't seen to be leading? That, in and of itself, I think, is where the 2016 candidates have a great opportunity. America and Americans are used to us leading, used to America being the leader of the world. And that, I do believe, is where the seeds of a resurgence of national security vision and strength can occur.
Okay, I think we've got about 10 or so minutes left, so we want to open it up for questions. Members of the audience, if you feel free, I think we have a microphone there and one over there somewhere. So if you have questions, please make your way to the mics. Whoever gets there first gets to ask the first question.
Race is on.
The race is on. Ms. Peggy Noonan.
Hello, good morning, gentlemen. I hope this is working. Thank you for all of you for being here and sharing with us your wisdom and also your experience and your sense of how things are going to go. Gentlemen, I have just one question, and I'd like to ask it to each of you down the row. What is the biggest specific thing in the U.S. military right now that you have seen suffer from the spending cuts and the sequester? I'm referring to one thing that you have noticed or seen or are seeing in the defense system that isn't working now because of the cuts, and that is a danger or potential danger to the security of the nation?
One is the reduction of the military personnel, obviously, but also procurement. And we, I'm not just saying for my friend here from the shipbuilding, but whether it's ships or airplanes, we've slowed down the acquisition of this equipment, these platforms, which increases the costs and put the lead time out. So that is a big problem.
I would say, Peggy, probably morale generally. And I want to tell you a short story. We got out of session in Congress. It was a Thursday, it may have been a Friday, and I flew back home. And I got home, and I pulled into my driveway, and I had my car at the airport that day. And I pulled into my driveway, and I walked out, and I saw my neighbor. And my neighbor was cutting his grass. I think it was on a Friday. And I said, "Oh, did you take the day off to be with your family and stuff?" And he said, "No, because of sequestration, we have days that we have to take off." And I could tell that this was something that was essentially weighing on his mind because of his finances and his family's finances. And as somebody that serves in Congress, I was kind of embarrassed because Congress is responsible for sequestration. But this has had an effect, and we had later conversations on what he does and the effect of sequestration on the role that these civilians are playing in supporting the military. But I think that it's affected morale.
Peggy, I think I'm going to bank off of what Joaquin just said and say, I believe, sitting here in the Reagan Library, it has been the question about American exceptionalism that is constantly being posed. And that, to me, is a failure of leadership at the very top that filters down. The pride that we have in our military, the pride that America and its values is something that is good for the world. I believe that that is all too often being questioned now. And it's not that we get it all right all the time, for sure. But I do think that America and its leadership role has been questioned here at home as to whether we should be in the leadership role anymore or whether we should just be like every other country. I think that is the one thing that does affect and has damaged the morale in our military, and I think also the mood in the country in general. Again, why 2016 will be so important.
Well, remember, these cuts occurred on a military that was already fragile, too small, wasn't able to recapitalize. So, and then this was imposed with no analysis whatsoever of the impact. So, I mean, the real answer is it's pretty much a disaster across the board, which is what Leon Panetta said it would be. But you had to pick one, you would say, because the last thing the military wants to let go is current readiness. I mean, day-to-day readiness. So that's the thing they'll protect above all else, the ability to deploy the forces that they have, and that's going. Okay, so I would say the cuts in training, most of the Army, that's the non-deployed Army, is not training above, company levels. The Air Force had to stand down a third of its squadrons for training. They haven't got all of them back up again. And the really ironic, terribly ironic thing about this is it is going to have to be fixed. At some point, we are going to make certain that we're ready on a short-term basis. And the cost of fixing it, of working down the backlogs in the depots, of training people, of getting back the personnel that were hemorrhaging junior officers, et cetera, in the Army, the cost of fixing all that's going to far exceed what it would have cost to keep it in the first place. So I would say short-term readiness if I had to pick one.
And since I get to go last and all the good answers have already been taken, I would say, I always kind of go back to what does it mean to the people? And you're in an environment now where you're not really sure that we have a consensus about the future of the service that our people might be in. We are stretching out deployments because of the dollars. The maintenance is not being done in certain. We have spaces where we would like to have 2 ships and we only have 1 there. And the military mindset is can do. We can do that. But the real challenge is that for most of my career, there was always a national consensus about the services. I used to call it the cooler heads on the legislative side and the executive branch would come together and figure this out. I'm not sure that there's a belief in the cooler head theory anymore. We're not quite sure who the cooler heads are going to be or who they are today that are going to get this sorted out. And if you're a machinist mate on a ship that's just been extended for 3 more months because you have to make your deployment, you kind of wonder, how engaged am I? And if the folks up there aren't engaged in this, how engaged should I be? That's something I worry about my business every day, and I just see it transcending into, so it shows up in readiness, it shows up in morale, it shows up in recruiting, it shows up in retention, it shows up in all of that. But I think it's a systemic, do we really have a view of where we're going so I can be part of that and extend myself and engage in it?
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. Thank you all. My name is Brian McGrath. I was wondering if whoever would like to comment would comment on whether that you believe that the Congress is taking the People's Republic of China seriously enough as a military threat.
Who wants that?
I'll start off with that. Obviously, China is moving aggressively in the South China Sea. I was just over in the Philippines. They're manufacturing islands, moving their territory by some kind of a theory that they have. If they build an island, that's part of their forward operating base, I suspect. It's a problem. Japan is worried. Obviously, South Korea is worried. Vietnam wants us back in Cam Ranh Bay, believe it or not. The Philippines want us back in Subic Bay. The Indonesians are worried. China is moving aggressively and looking for more and more resources to provide for their economy. So we should take it seriously. China is emerging, obviously, militarily, and they're extremely aggressive. And I think we should seriously take a strong look at what they're up to.
I would
go ahead.
I'm sorry. I would offer that certainly the interactions that I have with the Pentagon is that the Pentagon's taking this very seriously. But I think that the challenge is that you try to put problems into boxes that you've had before. When we went through the Cold War, we were really in a place where economically we could outpace the competition, and so we built a security apparatus to actually do that. I think China presents a very different challenge for us because I'm not sure that we know how the economic side of this is going to be and how that translates to the security piece of it. I think the path that we used the last time is probably not going to be the path that we use this time. Having said that, I can tell you that there's a lot of engagement in trying to figure out what are the potential problems and what are the things that we would need to do on the ground to sort things out.
I would say, I think in the broad sense, people in Washington, both the executive and legislative branch, are aware of the word threat or the challenge China presents as they assert themselves in the East and South China Sea, and as they increasingly challenge the norms of the international order, which the United States and its allies midwife. I don't think what anybody has come to terms with, and I think even in the building, is the extent to which their military buildup since the late 1990s is actually changing the balance of power in the East and South China Sea, and what that means in terms of their policy and our reaction. And I think it's hard. We're so used to having been the dominant power there. It's hard for us to confront the fact that they are in a very purposeful way developing the tools to exploit what they see as vulnerabilities in our posture. And I am concerned, yes, they're dealing with it, but I just am concerned that we've not really confronted what that means and how far along they are in that process.
We've got time for one more question, sir.
Morning, gents. I think it's been a great discussion about the issues of leadership and the Defense Department in American foreign policy. I think it was clear that everyone agrees that the military force structure is the great tool of the presidents as they execute their foreign policy. But what I've noted in the defense budget is that we have historically high defense budgets from a 50-year perspective, but yet we have a historically low force structure, as been pointed out. I wonder if the panel could discuss that paradox for us here.
Question was historically high. Historically low force structure, right. Senator Talent.
Yeah, the budget, if you compare it, for example, to the 80s and you apply inflation, et cetera, it's at a higher level than you would expect for what we're producing. As a percentage of GDP, however, it's low. I mean, it all depends on how you look at it. You know, we spent a fair amount of money in the last decade. Unfortunately, we didn't get the buildup, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is the cost of the war, which we were spending that money on. Another is because we were using a force that was too small at an op tempo that nobody had anticipated, including the platforms. Maintenance costs were higher than anybody. You know, use a force that's too small. You're flying the wings off the aircraft, so your maintenance costs go up. Personnel costs have gone up. And a lot of people are critical of that, but again, we've talked here about deployments. You're sending people out at sea for 9 months, and these are professionals. I mean, there's no such thing as a grunt anymore. I mean, these are people who, even in an economy where the labor market is fairly stagnant, have other opportunities, and they're volunteers. They don't have to be in there. I mean, I was there, and several others were too, when we did increase those benefits. First place, I thought they deserved it, and the second place, we needed to do something to sustain this force. So that money's been eaten up is the answer. And everybody here is talking about using money more wisely. I think we're all in agreement that we need to do that. But it won't cover the shortfall. I mean, nobody should kid themselves that we can do this more efficiently and we're not going to need a big increase in the top line, because it won't cover it. Certainly ought to do it, but we're going to have to come to grips with what we need to spend.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Again, I want to say on behalf of the panel what an honor and a privilege it was to be here with you today. And let's have a round of applause for our panel.
Good job.
All right, thanks, Congressman.